Living Joyfully Alone, the truth about friendship in old age. Picture this: you sit by a quiet river, the gentle current pulling its way over smooth stones as the last golden rays of the sun dance on the water's surface. The world around you is silent, save for the rhythmic sound of your breath, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of a bird. In these moments, time seems to stop. You don't have to do anything. You are simply being. Yet in the fast-paced world we live in, we've been taught to fear this stillness, haven't we? We've been told that solitude equals loneliness. Society whispers that if we're not constantly surrounded by people, we're somehow incomplete. And so we chase after the noise, the distractions, the endless need for validation from others. But what if solitude, this space we've been conditioned to dread, wasn't a void? What if it wasn't an absence, but a gateway? What if, instead of fear, solitude offers us something much deeper, something far more precious than we've ever realized? In the teachings of the Buddha, solitude is not something to avoid. It is a teacher, a guide, and ultimately, it is the path to liberation. The Buddha himself walked away from a life of luxury, from family and friends, in search of truth. In that solitude, he discovered a peace that transcends all worldly attachments. His journey became one of profound self-discovery and inner stillness, a journey that can be our own if we're willing to embrace it. As we grow older, many of us are faced with a unique opportunity, the gift of reflection. The world's demands soften, and we are given the space to truly listen, to understand ourselves in a way we've never been able to before. Solitude is no longer something to fear. It becomes a moment of profound clarity and transformation. In this video, I invite you to join me on a journey to explore why growing older is not about loss, but about rediscovery. We will delve into the profound truths hidden in the quietest corners of life, where peace and contentment reside, not in the company of others, but within the depths of our own hearts. This is a conversation you don't want to miss. What you will learn here today is not just wisdom for the years ahead, but a transformative shift in how you experience every day of your life. So, take a deep breath, settle into the stillness, and prepare to uncover truths that will resonate with you long after this video ends. If you find yourself moved by what you hear, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's walk this path together, exploring the profound wisdom that the Buddha has gifted to all of us. Your journey to true peace begins right here. Chapter 1: The Wisdom of Aging, Shifting Priorities. As the years pass, there is a subtle yet powerful shift that occurs within us, a shift that Buddha himself spoke of, one that brings us closer to the core of our true selves. In the rush of our youth, we often find ourselves trapped in a cycle of seeking approval from the world around us. We are constantly chasing after fleeting moments of connection, measuring our worth by the number of friends we have, the applause we receive, or the possessions we accumulate. It is a dance, a performance of sorts, in which we try to please others, to fit into the molds that society has shaped for us. Yet, from the perspective of Buddhism, this constant striving is the very source of our suffering. Buddha teaches us that attachment, whether to people, to our identities, or to the external world, is the root of our pain. We hold on to these things, believing that they will bring us lasting happiness, but they are impermanent. The friendships we cherish may fade, the success we've worked so hard for may crumble, and the approval we seek from others is always shifting, like sand slipping through our fingers. It is the nature of the world. Anicca impermanence reminds us that nothing lasts forever, but as we grow older, something extraordinary begins to happen. We no longer feel the compulsion to chase after validation from the outside world. This is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual unfolding, a deepening understanding that the pursuit of external things is not the path to true contentment. we begin to see that in the end, it is not the quantity of friends we have or the accolades we've collected that truly matters. What truly nourishes the soul is the quiet, simple joy of being at peace with ourselves. I remember a story shared by an elderly monk I once met in a remote monastery in Thailand. He had spent decades meditating alone in the mountains, far away from the busy distractions of the world. One day, a young traveler approached him, asking, "How do I find peace? How do I stop feeling so empty and restless?" The monk smiled softly and replied, "Peace is not something to be sought outside of yourself. It is already within you, but it is like a mountain stream. Often it is covered by the rocks of your distractions. Let them go and you will find the stillness beneath." That moment of quiet wisdom stuck with me for years. It illustrated what many of us discover as we grow older. The ability to be still, to simply be, is a power more profound than any achievement or relationship could ever provide. In that stillness, we find something that cannot be taken away from us: contentment. As we age, we are given the opportunity to rest from the frantic pace of life, to peel away the layers of attachment and expectation that we've accumulated over the years. We realize that we no longer need to prove anything to anyone. The noise of the world, the judgments, the comparisons, the external measures of success begins to fade, and in its place, a quiet joy starts to bloom. This joy is not dependent on anyone else's approval. It is the satisfaction of knowing, deeply and profoundly, that we are enough as we are. In this space of stillness, we begin to nurture a relationship with our own hearts. We come to understand the beauty of sati, mindfulness, and how this simple practice can transform the way we experience our own lives. Instead of seeking happiness in fleeting external experiences, we begin to look inward, where the true source of peace resides. Take the example of a woman named Mai, who lived in a bustling city for much of her life. She was a career-driven woman, constantly chasing after promotions and recognition. Her life was full of activity, meetings, social events, and a busy calendar. But as she entered her later years, she found herself with fewer social obligations and more time alone. Initially, she felt a sense of discomfort in the silence. "What am I supposed to do with all this time?" she asked herself. Yet as the days passed, something shifted within her. Mai began to embrace the stillness. She began walking in nature, reflecting on her life and finding joy in the simplest of things: the rustle of leaves in the wind, the scent of the earth after rain, and the feel of her own breath as she sat in quiet meditation. The world around her hadn't changed, but her relationship to it had. She no longer felt the need to fill her life with endless distractions. Instead, she found a deep, quiet contentment that she had never known before. In our older years, we are given the precious gift of time, a time to reflect on what truly matters, to realign ourselves with what brings us peace. And as we do so, we begin to experience life from a place of inner calm, rather than from the frenzied rush of chasing after what we think will bring us happiness. True contentment is not in the external world, but in the internal peace that comes from living in harmony with ourselves. This shift in perspective is not always easy. It takes time, patience, and practice. Yet with each passing day, we begin to realize that the quest for external validation was never the key to our happiness. The wisdom of aging teaches us that the truest form of joy comes from within. When we stop chasing after the approval of others, we free ourselves from the cycle of desire and attachment, and in that freedom we find peace. The lesson is simple yet profound. Contentment is not something to be obtained. It is something to be recognized, and it is in the quiet moments when we sit with ourselves without the need to prove anything that we discover the peace that has always been with us. As we grow older, may we embrace the wisdom that aging offers. May we learn to sit in stillness, to nurture our hearts, and to find joy in simply being. For in this deep acceptance of ourselves, we find a happiness that is not fleeting, but enduring. a happiness that transcends the impermanence of life and connects us to something much greater, the eternal peace that resides within us all. Chapter 2: Self-Reliance, the Path to Freedom. In the teachings of Buddhism, one of the most profound and transformative concepts is the idea of self-reliance. It's not merely a self-help mantra or a trendy catchphrase, but a cornerstone of the path to true liberation. When we think of the Buddha, we often imagine him as a figure who achieved enlightenment through the most radical act of self-reliance, leaving behind the comforts of a royal palace, the bonds of family, and the distractions of a worldly life. It's easy to imagine this act as one of rejection, a renunciation of life's pleasures and attachments, but in reality, it was a step towards freedom. The Buddha's choice to leave his life of luxury was not about rejecting the world or condemning the pleasures that life offers, but about stepping away from the illusion that they could bring lasting happiness. He realized, as do all those who follow the Buddhist path, that true freedom lies not in the pursuit of external approval, possessions, or even relationships. It lies in the ability to cultivate peace from within. At the heart of this teaching is a fundamental truth: everything we seek externally, whether it's approval from others, material wealth, or recognition, is impermanent. All of these things are subject to the whims of time, change, and circumstance. The only true and unchanging source of peace and fulfillment is found in the depths of our own hearts. As we age, this lesson becomes even more relevant. The years gradually strip away the distractions of youth. The rush to climb social ladders, to prove ourselves, to accumulate external markers of success fades into the background. We are left with the quiet invitation to turn inward, to recognize that the fulfillment we once thought we needed from others is already within us, waiting to be discovered. Self-reliance in aging doesn't mean rejecting others or retreating into isolation. On the contrary, it allows us to engage more deeply, more authentically with the world and those around us. We no longer need to reach out for validation because we are grounded in the understanding that we are already whole. We can approach our relationships not from a place of need or obligation, but from a space of genuine connection and mutual respect. In Buddhist practice, solitude is not seen as something to fear, but as a gift. The silence and stillness that comes with solitude open a space for introspection and self-reflection. It's in these moments of quiet that we are able to hear the soft whisper of wisdom that often gets drowned out by the noise of daily life. The Buddha himself spent years in solitary meditation, not because he despised the world, but because he sought to understand it more deeply. He knew that without solitude, the mind could not clear itself of distractions and attachments long enough to see the truth of its own nature. Solitude, in this sense, becomes a mirror. It reflects our true self, not the self we have constructed to meet the expectations of others, but the deeper, quieter self that exists beneath all of the roles and masks we wear. The power of this self-reflection is profound. It allows us to shed the layers of conditioning, societal pressures, and even our own fears. In silence, we begin to understand that the external world is not the source of our suffering or our joy. Instead, both arise from the relationship we cultivate with ourselves. A powerful example of this can be found in the story of a woman named Clara. In her younger years, Clara sought validation in the form of relationships and social approval. She was constantly busy, surrounded by friends, always going to events, and always engaging in conversations that gave her a sense of belonging. But as she grew older, she noticed that the friendships that once seemed so fulfilling began to feel empty, and the constant need for social interaction left her feeling exhausted. One day, Clara decided to take a step back. She spent a few days alone in her garden, a place she had always loved but never truly appreciated in her busyness. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable, almost unbearable. But as the days passed, something shifted within her. She began to appreciate the simple beauty of nature, the feel of the soil beneath her fingers, the sound of birdsong in the morning, the scent of the flowers blooming around her. Slowly, Clara realized that in this solitude, she was not alone at all. She was deeply connected to the earth, to her own breath, and to the quiet wisdom that had always been there, waiting for her to notice. Clara's story is not unique. As we age, we are all given the opportunity to engage in this process of self-reflection. The more we allow ourselves to sit with our own thoughts, without the distraction of other people's opinions or the endless noise of modern life, the more we come to understand that peace is not something that can be sought in the world. It is already within us, always has been, and always will be. The beauty of self-reliance is that it gives us the freedom to live on our own terms. We no longer need to seek validation from the outside world because we know that we are enough just as we are. We are free to engage in the world from a place of authenticity, not obligation. We can choose to be with others because we truly want to be, not because we need them to make us feel whole. Self-reliance is also an act of great compassion. When we rely on ourselves for peace and fulfillment, we are able to offer others the gift of our presence without the burden of expectation or need. We can truly be there for others because we are already whole within ourselves. We can love, support, and share with others freely without the fear of being depleted or needing something in return. As we embrace self-reliance, we are not isolating ourselves from the world, but rather deepening our connection to it. We begin to engage with the world in a way that is more grounded and compassionate. We no longer feel the pressure to meet external expectations or to live up to the roles that others have placed upon us. Instead, we can walk through life with the understanding that true happiness comes not from what we accumulate or what others think of us, but from the peace that resides within. In conclusion, self-reliance is the path to freedom, not the freedom to escape the world, but the freedom to engage with it fully from a place of inner peace. The Buddha's journey into solitude was not one of rejection, but one of discovery. It was a return to the self, a self that was always whole, always complete, always at peace. As we walk this path ourselves, let us remember that the true source of fulfillment is not in the approval of others or the possessions we acquire. It is within us, in the quiet space where we can truly hear the wisdom of our own hearts. Chapter 3: Quality over Quantity, the Art of Meaningful Relationships. In our early years, many of us navigate the world through the lens of what we can gather: friends, experiences, social interactions, believing that the more connections we accumulate, the more complete we become. Relationships often serve as mirrors, reflecting our identities back to us, shaping our sense of belonging and self-worth. We surround ourselves with as many people as we can, seeking validation in the numbers, in the outward signs of acceptance. But as we age, there comes a profound realization. The value of relationships is not determined by their quantity, but by their depth. This understanding is one of the great lessons of Buddhist philosophy. Buddhism teaches us that everything is impermanent, including the relationships we form. Like all things in life, friendships, whether cherished or fleeting, are subject to change. Friends may come into our lives for a season and leave when their purpose in our journey has been fulfilled. It is in this realization that we start to understand that true connection doesn't lie in the quantity of our interactions, but in the authenticity of those we engage with. True friends are those who see us not as who we pretend to be, but as who we truly are. These are the relationships that endure, ones rooted in sincerity, where there is no pretense, no need for validation, no hidden agendas. When we let go of the need to be constantly surrounded by a crowd, we make room for deeper, more meaningful relationships, ones that nourish our hearts and souls. Consider the story of the Buddha and his relationship with his disciples. In his teachings, the Buddha emphasized the importance of genuine connection and the impermanence of all things. He didn't seek to amass a large following for the sake of popularity. His true teachings, he believed, would find their way to those who were ready, those who would approach him with sincerity, seeking liberation not for external gain, but for spiritual peace. His circle was not wide, but it was deeply meaningful. In one particular story, the Buddha shared a moment with his disciple Ananda, who was distressed by the number of people coming to see him. Ananda said, "Master, how can we reach everyone? How can we make sure no one is left behind?" Buddha responded, "It is not the number of people who listen to me that matters, Ananda, but the depth with which they listen. It is not the quantity of those we share wisdom with, but the quality of their reception." This is the essence of Buddhism's approach to relationships. It's not about having 1,000 acquaintances. It's about having those rare, transformative connections that help us grow, that support us on our journey to liberation. We can be surrounded by a sea of people and still feel alone if those relationships are built on the illusion of companionship rather than authentic connection. Take, for example, the elderly woman named Ruth, who had lived most of her life in bustling cities, constantly surrounded by people. Yet, despite her numerous friendships, she found herself feeling increasingly isolated as she grew older. The friends she had once leaned on were scattered, some had moved away, and others drifted into different phases of life. Ruth began to feel the weight of superficial interactions, small talk at parties, casual greetings in the grocery store. None of it felt fulfilling. She longed for something deeper, something more substantial. One day, Ruth reconnected with an old friend, Margaret, with whom she had shared a profound connection decades earlier. Unlike the many acquaintances she had accumulated, Margaret was someone with whom Ruth could share her true self, without judgment, without the need to impress. Their reunion was quiet and simple. A shared cup of tea, conversation that lingered on memories and insights, and the kind of laughter that only those who have known each other deeply can share. It was in this simple act of connection that Ruth realized what had been missing in her life. The warmth of truly being seen. This is the kind of relationship that Buddhism encourages us to cultivate, a relationship that is not based on the external markers of success or status, but on the internal connection of shared wisdom, love, and authenticity. It is in these quiet moments of genuine connection that we find peace. It is not in the flurry of social gatherings or the superficial validation we seek from others, but in the quiet moments shared with a select few who nourish our spirits and support our journey towards understanding. As we age, we may feel the need to reassess the relationships in our lives. We may no longer have the energy to maintain dozens of superficial connections. Instead, we become more selective, choosing to invest our time and energy in the relationships that bring us peace, that make us feel whole, and that nurture our well-being. Buddhism teaches us to be mindful of our attachments. Attachment to the idea of having many friends, or to the expectation that our worth is measured by how many people we know, only leads to suffering. Letting go of the need for quantity allows us to focus on the quality of our connections, and in doing so, we experience a deep sense of freedom. When we are no longer tethered to the expectation of constant validation, we are free to engage with others from a place of love, not need. In the art of meaningful relationships, we come to understand that silence, presence, and authenticity are more valuable than the loud noise of social obligation. A single, heartfelt conversation, shared with someone who truly understands us, carries more weight than years of superficial interactions. A smile exchanged with a stranger, a moment of compassion given freely, can carry more meaning than an entire lifetime of performing for the approval of others. In the end, what remains are not the number of people we knew, but the depth of the connections we forged. It's not the quantity of friends that matters, but the quality of those friendships. True companionship is born not from the noise of the world, but from the stillness of the heart, from the understanding that we are enough as we are, and that those who truly care for us will be there, not because they need something from us, but because they see and honor our true selves. In the quiet, in the simple moments, we find the richest relationships, those that nourish our souls and lead us towards deeper understanding. As we age, let us remember that the deepest connections in life are not found in the number of people we know, but in the moments of authenticity and presence that we share with those who truly matter. Chapter 4: Solitude, a sacred space for reflection. In our busy, interconnected world, solitude is often misunderstood. It is frequently seen as something to be avoided, a space to fear, an absence of connection, a void to be filled. We fill our lives with noise, distractions, and endless obligations in an attempt to escape the silence that solitude brings. But in the Buddhist tradition, solitude is not a form of punishment. It is a sacred space for reflection, for growth, and for deepening our connection with the present moment. The Buddha himself spent countless hours meditating in solitude, seeking not isolation, but clarity. He understood that only in stillness could the mind be freed from the noise of the world. It was in solitude, away from the distractions of the palace and the clamor of his former life, that he could confront his own thoughts, face his desires, and ultimately find the path to enlightenment. This journey of self-discovery, of going inward, is at the heart of Buddhist practice. When we sit alone in silence, we are presented with the opportunity to reflect on our lives. It is in these moments of stillness that we can look back at the choices we've made, the paths we've walked, and the person we have become. Solitude gives us the chance to accept our past, both the joys and the sorrows, and to make peace with the mistakes we've made. There is no judgment, no one to blame, and no need to explain ourselves. In solitude, we are free to simply be. Take the story of a monk who once sought guidance from his teacher. He was struggling with feelings of regret for his past actions, unsure of how to move forward. The teacher, in his infinite wisdom, led the monk to a quiet, secluded place in the forest and asked him to sit in silence for several days. The monk, initially frustrated, found himself surrounded by the vastness of nature, silent, still, and alone with his thoughts. Over time, he came to realize that the peace he sought was not something he could find in the world around him, but something that had always been within him. Through his time in solitude, he learned that the past, with all its burdens, could be released. What mattered now was the present moment, and in that moment he was whole. This lesson, though profound, is something many of us have experienced. We live our lives chasing after approval, chasing after success, or trying to avoid the uncomfortable feelings that arise when we are alone. But in solitude, we realize that we don't need to chase anything at all. We are already complete. There is nothing lacking in us, no emptiness that needs to be filled with external distractions. The Buddha's teachings point us to the core truth of this. The peace we seek is not something we can find in the outside world, but in the quiet space within ourselves. When we allow ourselves the gift of solitude, we come to understand that we are never truly alone. The silence that may initially feel uncomfortable becomes a source of profound connection. In this space, we can hear the whispers of our own heart, the wisdom that has always been present, waiting to be acknowledged. Solitude is not about withdrawing from life or the world, but about turning inward so that we can engage with the world in a more mindful, compassionate way. When we spend time alone, we allow ourselves to reconnect with our true nature. We begin to recognize that our worth is not defined by what we do or by the approval of others, but by the peace we cultivate within ourselves. In the practice of Buddhism, solitude is often described as the foundation for meditation, which itself is the foundation for true understanding. It's only when we sit in silence, without the need to entertain or distract ourselves, that we can begin to witness the mind in its purest form. We become aware of the constant chatter, the worries, the fears, and over time, we learn to let them go. In doing so, we discover that true peace arises when we stop fighting against the flow of life and simply allow ourselves to be. There's a story from the Zen tradition that beautifully illustrates this point. A young student eager to learn asked his master, "What is the secret to happiness?" The master, without saying a word, led the student to a quiet room where they sat together in silence. Hours passed, and still there was no answer. The student, frustrated and restless, finally broke the silence. "Master, why do we not speak?" he asked. The master smiled gently and replied, "In the silence, all things are revealed. When you stop seeking and simply listen, you will know the answer." This story highlights the power of silence and solitude. In a world where we are constantly bombarded by information, opinions, and demands, we forget that the answers to our most pressing questions are often already within us. All we need to do is create the space to listen. Solitude allows us to reconnect with this wisdom. When we sit in silence, free from the need to entertain or distract ourselves, we discover that peace is not something we need to chase. It is something that already resides within us. The simple act of being present with ourselves without judgment or expectation reveals the truth that we are complete just as we are. This realization is liberating. It means that we no longer need to seek fulfillment in external achievements or relationships. Instead, we can cultivate a deep sense of contentment by simply being. We come to understand that true peace comes not from what we accumulate or from the approval of others, but from the quiet acceptance of ourselves and our place in the world. As we age, this lesson becomes even more apparent. The busy demands of life may slow down, leaving us with more time for solitude. And in that solitude, we find an opportunity not only for reflection, but for deep inner peace. The rush of our younger years begins to fade, and we are left with the wisdom that true fulfillment comes from within. In solitude, we can sit with our past, let go of our regrets, and embrace the present moment with full awareness. So the next time you find yourself alone, don't shy away from the silence. Instead, embrace it as a sacred space for reflection and growth. In solitude, you will discover that you are already whole, already complete. True peace comes from within, and when we allow ourselves the space to sit in that peace, we come to realize that we are never truly alone. We are always connected to the wisdom of our hearts, to the deeper truths of life, and to the present moment where all things are revealed. Chapter 5: The Role of Family and Community. In the journey of life, there are few bonds as profound as those we share with family and community. While solitude offers a sacred space for self-reflection and growth, it is equally important to recognize the role that our relationships with others play in shaping who we are and how we experience the world. As we age, the significance of family and community deepens, not out of obligation or societal expectation, but through a growing recognition of the love, wisdom, and support these connections bring. In Buddhism, the concept of interdependence plays a crucial role. We are all connected, not in isolation, but through an intricate web of relationships and shared experiences. This interconnectedness is at the heart of our human experience. While we may find peace and solace in solitude, the true richness of life often unfolds in the company of others. The Buddha himself spoke of Sangha, the community of practitioners, as one of the three jewels of Buddhism, emphasizing the importance of fellowship on the path to enlightenment. As we grow older, the roles we play within our families and communities evolve. In our youth, we may have sought approval from others, or filled our lives with social engagements to feel validated. But as time passes, these external expectations give way to a deeper understanding of the power of genuine connection. The relationships that matter most are not those based on obligation or convenience, but those rooted in authenticity, those that have stood the test of time and are grounded in shared experiences, love, and understanding. Consider the story of a grandmother named May, who, after raising her children and seeing them become adults with families of their own, found herself at a crossroads. She had spent decades focusing on her children, nurturing their growth, and ensuring they had everything they needed to succeed. Yet, as they moved on with their lives, May felt a certain emptiness. For a time, she sought to fill that void by seeking out more friends and participating in social gatherings. But over time, she began to realize that it wasn't more acquaintances that she needed. It was the deep, meaningful connections she had once shared with her children. May began to shift her focus. She started to spend more time with her grandchildren, sharing stories of her youth, telling them the lessons she had learned, and showing them how to live with compassion and mindfulness. It was in these quiet moments of connection, whether it was cooking together in the kitchen or sitting quietly watching the sunset, that May rediscovered the joy of being present with those she loved. Through these simple acts of giving, through her wisdom, love, and guidance, she found a sense of fulfillment that was far deeper than any social gathering had ever provided. This story reflects a profound truth. As we age, we are not only given the gift of time, but we are also entrusted with the opportunity to pass on the lessons we have learned. Our families and communities become the vessels through which we share our wisdom. We have the chance to offer guidance, not out of a sense of duty or expectation, but out of a deep and genuine love for those who come after us. These connections are no longer defined by the frantic pace of life or the need to fulfill societal roles. They are grounded in a shared understanding of what truly matters: love, kindness, and compassion. Buddhism teaches us that one of the most important aspects of living a fulfilled life is to dana, to give. But true giving is not about material wealth or even grand gestures. It is about sharing our time, our wisdom, and our presence with those around us. It is about creating a space for others to grow, to learn, and to feel supported in their own journeys. The Buddha himself taught that the most precious form of generosity is the giving of the Dharma, the sharing of wisdom and understanding that can guide others toward enlightenment. As we age, we are uniquely positioned to serve as guides for the younger generations. We carry with us a wealth of experiences, lessons learned from both our triumphs and our failures. These lessons are not just for us to keep, but are meant to be shared, passed down, and carried forward. By doing so, we continue to impact the world long after we are gone. The legacy we leave is not measured in material wealth or the number of achievements we have amassed, but in the lives we have touched, the wisdom we have shared, and the love we have given. Take the example of an elderly woman known in her community for her kindness and unwavering support. In her younger years, she had been a teacher, imparting knowledge to countless students, but as she grew older, her role shifted. She no longer sought to teach in the traditional sense. Instead, she became a mentor to young families, offering advice on parenting, relationships, and living with mindfulness. Her presence in the community was a quiet yet powerful force, reminding everyone of the importance of being present, of offering a listening ear, and of giving from the heart. Though she no longer had the same energy she once did, her wisdom and love continued to shape the lives of those around her. Through these stories, we see that family and community are not just about the relationships we form, but about the legacy we create through our actions and our words. As we age, we may not have the same physical energy we once had, but we possess something far more valuable: the wisdom to understand what truly matters and the ability to offer that wisdom to others. Our families and communities become the vessels for this wisdom, and in turn, they nourish and sustain us. Buddhism teaches us that our connection to others is not an accident, but a profound aspect of our journey. The relationships we cultivate are the very fabric of our lives. They offer us the opportunity to practice compassion, to give without expectation, and to witness the ripple effects of our actions in the lives of others. In the later years of life, we are reminded of the importance of these connections, not as obligations, but as blessings. It is in these bonds, in the simple acts of love, kindness, and presence, that we find our true fulfillment. We are not meant to journey through life alone, but to walk alongside others, offering what we can, learning from them, and together, walking the path of wisdom and compassion. In the end, it is not the quantity of relationships we have, but the quality of the connections we make that leaves the deepest imprint on our lives. Through the bonds we share with family and community, we continue to give, continue to learn, and continue to grow, even as the years pass. And in doing so, we create a legacy that will endure long after we are gone. Chapter 6: Letting Go of Social Expectations. As we age, there is a remarkable shift in our perception of what truly matters. The pressures that once seemed so paramount, the need to conform, to meet societal expectations of success, friendship, and status, begin to lose their grip on us. The wisdom of years lived teaches us that these external markers of worth are not what define us. In fact, they are often distractions, pulling us away from our deepest sense of self and peace. True contentment comes not from adhering to these societal pressures, but from the profound freedom that arises when we let go of them. In Buddhism, the concept of anatta, the doctrine of no self, reminds us that our identity is not something fixed, nor is it something we should cling to. Our ego, with its desires for approval, recognition, and social validation, is not who we truly are. Rather, we are constantly evolving, and the truest expression of ourselves comes when we release the need for external validation and live in alignment with the stillness within us. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from attachment, the attachment to people, to status, and to our identities. Much of the suffering we endure in life comes from the deep-seated belief that we must constantly prove ourselves to the world. We chase after achievements, friendships, and social approval, thinking that they will provide us with a sense of purpose and belonging. But as time passes, we begin to see that all of these things are transient. The friendships that once seemed essential may fade, societal expectations will change, and even our own identity may shift. These external sources of validation are impermanent, and thus they cannot be relied upon for true happiness. Consider the example of Henry, a man in his 60s who had spent most of his life chasing professional success and societal approval. For decades, he worked tirelessly, trying to climb the corporate ladder, impressing his colleagues, and fulfilling the expectations placed upon him by his family and peers. He measured his worth by his job title, the number of friends he had, and his social standing. But as he reached his later years, he began to feel a growing sense of emptiness. The success he had worked so hard to achieve felt hollow, and he found himself surrounded by people who were not true companions, but mere acquaintances. Henry began to question, what is the point of all this? One day he sat quietly with his thoughts and reflected on his life. He realized that in all his years of striving for approval, he had never truly asked himself what he wanted, what brought him peace, what made him feel fulfilled. In that moment of stillness, Henry recognized that he no longer needed to chase after validation. The desire to prove himself to others faded, and in its place was a sense of calm acceptance. He no longer felt the weight of expectations. Henry found that by letting go of the need for external approval, he could finally live authentically. He could choose how to spend his time, whom to be with, and what to pursue, not because it was expected of him, but because it resonated with his true self. This is the essence of letting go in Buddhism. By releasing our attachment to social expectations, we free ourselves from the constant pressure to conform. We begin to make choices based on what aligns with our values rather than what society deems important. And in this freedom, we find peace. It is a peace that is not dependent on the approval of others, but on the authenticity of living in alignment with who we truly are. Take, for instance, the example of a woman named Clara, who, after retiring from a long career, found herself at a crossroads. For years, Clara had been defined by her job and the expectations surrounding it. She had always been the successful one, hardworking, driven, and always achieving. But when she stepped away from her career, she realized that she no longer felt the need to compete or prove her worth through external accomplishments. Instead, Clara began to focus on what truly nourished her soul. She spent time with her family, embraced her love for painting, and connected with old friends without the pressure to impress. In letting go of the need to be constantly productive or successful by society's standards, Clara found herself more fulfilled than she had ever been. She no longer felt the urge to prove anything to anyone. Her relationships deepened, and she rediscovered a love for life that she had long forgotten. Clara's story is a powerful reminder that when we let go of the external pressures and live authentically, we create space for a deeper, more meaningful connection to ourselves and others. Buddhism teaches us that true freedom comes from releasing attachment. When we stop clinging to external markers of success or the opinions of others, we can finally live from a place of inner peace. We are no longer defined by our titles, possessions, or the number of friends we have. Instead, we are free to define ourselves by our own values, our actions, and our capacity to love. This shift in perspective is incredibly liberating. It allows us to say no to relationships, situations, or commitments that drain us, and to say yes to those that nourish us. We stop giving our energy to people or things that no longer align with our authentic self. Instead, we invest our time in what brings us peace, joy, and fulfillment. The beauty of letting go of social expectations is that it allows us to embrace the present moment. We no longer live in the shadow of past achievements or the pressure of future success. We are free to live fully in the here and now, guided by our inner stillness. In this space, we find that true happiness is not found in the pursuit of external validation, but in the quiet acceptance of who we are and what truly matters. The lesson here is simple yet profound. True peace comes when we release the need to conform to societal expectations. We begin to live authentically, guided by the stillness within us. In this freedom, we find joy, contentment, and a deeper connection to ourselves and others. Letting go is not about rejecting the world or abandoning our responsibilities. It is about living from a place of freedom and authenticity, choosing what serves our highest good, and embracing the truth of who we are. Chapter 7: Embracing the Gift of Our Own Company. As we age, there comes a time when we must confront the profound gift of solitude, not as something to be feared or avoided, but as a source of immense peace and self-discovery. In the frenzy of our younger years, we often look outward for fulfillment, chasing achievements, seeking validation, gathering friends and experiences, believing that happiness lies in the things we possess or the people around us. We measure our worth by external markers, how many connections we have, how successful we appear, or how loved we feel. But as time passes, we begin to realize a deeper truth. Happiness is not something that comes from the outside. It is something we must cultivate within ourselves. Buddhism teaches that true happiness arises from within. The Buddha himself, in his quest for enlightenment, turned inward. He left behind the comforts of palace life, the distractions of society, and sought solitude under the Bodhi tree. There, in the stillness, he found a deep and lasting peace, not because he was isolated from the world, but because he connected deeply with the essence of who he was, free from the distractions and attachments that had once defined him. This is the power of solitude in Buddhist philosophy. It is not a punishment, nor an absence of life, but a sacred space where we can reconnect with the truth of our own being. As we grow older, we are gifted with more time to reflect, to sit in the quiet moments that we may have once filled with noise. It is in these moments of stillness that we can finally hear the whisper of our true selves. Far from being empty or lonely, solitude in our later years becomes an opportunity to explore what truly nourishes our spirit, what gives our life meaning, and what we need to let go of to be at peace. Consider the story of Thomas, a man in his 70s who, after years of busy professional life and raising a family, found himself alone in retirement. Initially, he struggled with the silence. The days felt long, and the absence of constant activity left him uneasy. He was used to the company of others, to the chatter of meetings and the noise of family life. But as the months passed, Thomas began to sit in the quiet of his home more often. At first, he was uncomfortable, but slowly, he began to listen to the thoughts and feelings that arose in the silence. He rediscovered his love for reading, found solace in gardening, and most unexpectedly began to write, something he had always longed to do but had never made the time for. Through this quiet reflection, Thomas began to see that solitude was not something to escape. It was in these moments that he uncovered parts of himself that had been buried beneath years of striving and pleasing others. He realized that he had lived much of his life for external approval, career accomplishments, social gatherings, family expectations. But now, in his solitude, he found a deep sense of inner peace that he had never known before. He no longer needed the validation of the outside world. He was whole just as he was. In Buddhist teachings, the practice of meditation is often centered around cultivating stillness and being present with ourselves. The Buddha encouraged his followers to sit in silence, to observe the mind without attachment, and to experience the present moment fully. This practice, while it may seem simple, is transformative. It teaches us to be with ourselves without judgment or distraction, to sit with the fullness of who we are, and to recognize that we are already complete. The more we practice being with ourselves in this way, the more we come to understand that true peace arises from within. We do not need to search for happiness in the world around us. It is already present in our hearts. Solitude, in this sense, becomes a form of liberation. We release ourselves from the need to fill every moment with activity or the company of others. We stop seeking approval, stop striving for things that are outside of our control, and we simply allow ourselves to be. This freedom is profound. It allows us to embrace life as it is, not as we wish it to be. We no longer live in the shadow of what we should do, but in the light of what we truly want to do. And in this space we find joy. Take the example of Mary, an elderly woman who, after the loss of her spouse, found herself living alone for the first time in decades. Initially, she felt lost. The house felt too quiet, and the days stretched endlessly before her. But over time, Mary began to embrace the silence. She started to write letters to her children, sharing the lessons she had learned in her life. She spent her afternoons walking in the park, taking in the beauty of nature and listening to the sounds of the world around her. She found that in these moments of solitude, she began to feel a deep sense of connection, not just to her own heart, but to the world around her. She realized that she didn't need to fill her life with distractions. She was enough just as she was. Through her solitude, Mary came to understand that true contentment is not found in external circumstances, but in our ability to sit in stillness and embrace who we are. Solitude allowed her to grieve, to heal, and to rediscover her passions. She no longer felt the pressure to live up to anyone's expectations. She could live authentically, guided by the wisdom she had accumulated over the years. This is the gift of our own company, the ability to be at peace with ourselves, to recognize that we are whole and that we do not need the approval of others to feel complete. In the quiet of solitude, we find the space to reflect on our lives, to accept ourselves fully, and to move forward with a sense of freedom and purpose. As we walk the path of aging, let us embrace this gift of solitude. Let us sit in the quiet, not with fear, but with reverence. In that stillness, we will find ourselves, and in that discovery, we will be free. The noise of the world fades away, and we are left with the truth of our own hearts. There in the peace of solitude, we are whole, and in that wholeness, we find true happiness. As we near the end of this exploration, one thing becomes clear. The journey to true peace and fulfillment is not about what we acquire, the number of people we know, or the titles we carry. It is about embracing the stillness within us, letting go of the societal pressures, and finding contentment in solitude and authenticity. The wisdom we've discussed today is not merely a lesson in aging, it is a timeless guide to living a life full of peace, love, and self-understanding. But here's the real question. Are you ready to embrace the gift of your own company, to step away from the noise and find the stillness that holds the key to your true self? To finally release the pressures of the outside world and live authentically? These are not easy questions to answer, but they are the ones that led to the deepest truths of our existence. If you found value in the wisdom shared here, don't let it stop with just this video. There's so much more to explore, so many more insights waiting for you. This channel is dedicated to guiding you through the path of self-discovery, inner peace, and the timeless teachings of Buddhism that can truly transform your life. If you haven't already, hit that like button, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more content that brings you closer to the life you've always sought, one that's deeply rooted in authenticity, love, and inner freedom. Thank you for being here. Keep walking the path, and together, we'll continue uncovering the wisdom that leads us to the peace we all deserve.